Hello and welcome to my channel. I found this little write-up to be so interesting. And it says, Ghostbusters detective Paul Dotson has publicly explained that he was the WPD representative to the creation of the Multi-Agency Investigative Team Manual for the Serial Killer Task Forces. In the 1980s, a National Institute for Justice grant helped pay for a meeting to design aids to local law enforcement in multiple agency response to serial murder investigations. Dotson wrote, Our group advocated the requirement for close cooperation and collaboration between all jurisdictions, law enforcement, and prosecutors from the beginning of any possible serial murder investigation through the final prosecutions. We refer to our team concept as a multi-agency investigative team approach. Our published manual addressed most components found in complex serial murder investigation. The intent was to maximize all investigative resources to identify and successfully prosecute the serial killer. I started studying task forces of the past that had investigated serial cases with positive outcomes. The investigation cases I studied included the Boston Strangler, the Unabomber, the Atlanta child murders, and the Green River Killer case. The Boston Strangler task force was believed to have captured the criminal they sought, but due to DNA testing, we now know that Albert DeSalvo was not the Boston Strangler. Susan Kelly's 2002 The Boston Stranglers reports that Albert DeSalvo's body was exhumed, and on December 7, 2001, it was announced that DNA testing had excluded him as the murderer of Mary Sullivan, the final victim attributed to the Boston Strangler. Author Kelly reveals the dynamics of the task force that led to their acceptance of Albert DeSalvo as being the Boston Strangler. DeSalvo has never been prosecuted as the Strangler. He could not have been prosecuted because there was insufficient evidence against him to bring him to trial. Not one police officer. Did I misread that? No, it says was not the Boston Strangler. Oh well, anyway. Not one police officer from any of the towns where the Boston Strangler's crimes were committed ever interviewed DeSalvo. DeSalvo was interrogated only by people on or obtained by the task force. DeSalvo was convicted of crimes other than those of the Strangler. It was criminal defense attorney F. Lee Bailey's idea to have DeSalvo publicly confess to being the Strangler. Bailey thought that this confession would lead to DeSalvo being put in a mental institution. Instead, DeSalvo was put in prison where he was murdered. John Douglas wrote on page 362 of his book, The Case That Haunts Us, there is no evidence that Albert DeSalvo had any knowledge or insight as to the true identity of the Boston Strangler or Stranglers. Individuals and agencies on the Boston Strangler Task Force did not work well together, and the task force was a failure. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was caught, but not by the task force per se, at the recommendation of Attorney General Janet Reno and FBI Director Louis Freeh on Tuesday, I don't know if I pronounced it right, September 19, 1995, exact 5 months after the Oklahoma City bombing. The Washington Post was the first to publish the Unabomber's manifesto. The Unabomber was number 1 on the FBI's most wanted list. He had eluded capture for 17 years. The FBI task force had not developed any leads to the Unabomber. They thought it might, and I think I'm out of pages. But it's so interesting. So you can see how interesting this book is. And I saw this and I thought, wow, this is interesting. This is chapter 28, The Task Force. And it's so interesting. So I can scroll back. But yeah, I'm like so into it that I want to get the book. But it's missing pages. Whoops. I don't know how far down it goes. I don't know if I can go up that way. No. Let's see how far to go. Because this is such an interesting book. And I just was Googling for information and I ran across it on Google Books. Well, anyway, thought it was really interesting. So I wanted to read that because I was just fascinated by that part that I just randomly came upon. And I'm going to try to rewind it. Whoops. I'll rewind it a little bit more if it'll go. Oh, here we go, here we go. I should get this book, right? There's a lot of blank pages. There we go. There's the book. No Leads on Murders. Nightmare in Wichita. Includes the latest update on the case. The Hunt for the BTK Strangler by Robert Beattie. So then it has the contents. So in case you want to get this book and read this book, I just thought this book was really interesting. And if I'm scrolling too fast, you can always pause it. Whoops. But I just saw that part and I thought, wow, that was interesting. So if you're fascinated by it, you can get it. And there's an introduction in American Mystery. It says for over 30 years, from 1974 to 2004, the serial killer, self-named BTK for bind, torture, kill, has telephoned and written to police and press advising that he is still stalking victims, still waiting in the dark, and preparing to kill again. He murdered at least 10 people and attempted to murder at least 6 more, and he has always done what he threatened to do. BTK is unique. He may be the only criminal that meets the federal criteria to be defined all at once as a mass murderer, a serial killer, and a domestic terrorist. He is the only killer to communicate with the police and press for more than 30 years and remain unidentified. Other infamous killers, including Zodiac, the Green River Killer, Ted Bundy, and Jack the Ripper, either stopped communicating or were identified after no more than 20 years. BTK is now in his 4th decade of committing state and federal crimes, including making death threats. He has been suspected of committing murders outside of Kansas. At one time, police concluded that he murdered a New York resident in New Orleans, Louisiana, but he kept that secret. BTK phoned the police to report one of his murders. He wrote to law enforcement and the media offering details of the crime scenes. In 1974 and 2004, he left packages in the main branch of the Wichita Public Library. He sent messages via a television station, a newspaper, a library, a UPS box, the police department, and victims. He taunted that he enjoyed seeing the terror in women's eyes. Victims were attacked in the security of their own home, and most were strangled in the safety of their own beds. The killer called them homicides. Some tough cops coped with this horror by muttering, "Well, there's no place like home," turning the famous Kansas City phrase from The Wizard of Oz into macabre black humor. In 2003, one detective told me that in his retirement he has not been able to enjoy fishing in his boat on the lake without imagining he sees BTK crime scene evidence. He was waiting for the day when BTK was identified and he would be able to go fishing and just fish. BTK attacked both in the daylight and at night, both when the family was at home and when the victim was alone. Wichitans became suspicious of people they knew, the people they worked with, strangers, every male in town. Frustrated, police investigated a wide swath of possible suspects, anyone who might have given voluntary access to the victims, including utility workers, plumbers, and reporters. Eventually, many cops' DNA was tested to see if it matched that of the strangler. So were former Wichita State University students, postal employees, Coleman employees, and any mail reported to the Wichita Police anonymous BTK hotline. As of this time of this writing, about 5,000 men have been tested. During BTK panics in and around Wichita, where I live, wild suspicions festered in our souls at night when we just knew that he was hiding somewhere in the darkness. We know that at least twice at night he had hidden in a woman's bedroom closet and waited for her to return. With Nancy Jo Fox and Anna Williams, there was no relief from fear in the daytime because we knew that he could appear at the front door and use a ruse to gain entry, so he did with Shirley Vian. I don't know how to pronounce her name. The book you are reading started as a chapter for a classroom exercise. When I wanted my students to learn about this aspect of Wichita history, I looked for a book about the BT case. To my surprise and disappointment, I learned that not only was there no book, but that the story was largely unknown, forgotten, misunderstood, or mistaken. Early in my career, I worked in the emergency room at Wesley Medical Center with the Emergency Medical Service ambulance, and then as a firefighter medic. I met many officers and detectives who worked on the BTK investigation, and they told me many facts about the investigation. Many years later, I started to write about this case. I learned it was going to be difficult to accurately chronicle. Like an unpleasant death in the family, BTK conversation was taboo. Many who knew the facts were reluctant to be forthcoming. I have conducted interviews with more than 130 people, but perhaps an equal number declined to talk. Even those I interviewed were often circumspect with what they revealed. I had no idea of my project's consequences. Many detectives tell me they believe the first edition of my book caused BTK to begin making contact again in 2004. That without my book being written, he might not have come out of hiding. I interviewed many Wichita women who told me that for the past 30 years they have lived only in second floor or high bedrooms because they knew that BTK had broken into the homes of women who had first floor and basement bedrooms. Dozens of men and women told me that on returning home their habit was still to check their phone for a dial tone because BTK was known to cut telephone lines. Before entering their residences, many women used a cell phone to call home and verify that their answering machine was working, indicating that their home phone line had not been cut. Some slept beside their cell phones and their guns. Cops who had worked on the case told me that when new detectives started working on the case, they were told not to talk to old detectives who had preceded them, so as not to be contaminated by them. The reasoning was that since the previous detectives had not solved the case, they must have made errors. Each time I talked to a retired detective, I was surprised to hear the same litany. No investigator from the police department had asked them a question about the BTK case since the day their assignment to it ended. I obtained more cross-generational knowledge of the police investigation than most of the detectives on the case. After the investigation began anew in March 2004, I learned that because they had never talked with the old investigators, the current investigators were at times operating with mistaken information. On at least one occasion, the young cops thought what I communicated to them was wrong, and they checked with the old cops. The old cops told the young cops that my version of the facts was correct. The young cops, the current investigators, still thought that the old cops and I were wrong, until they found an old report verifying that what I was writing was correct, was right. I am keeping my pledges to withhold certain information, and I've changed the names of some individuals who wish to maintain their privacy, but in my view, this is a story that deserves to be told about people who deserve to be remembered, the victims, their friends and families, the cops who have investigated this case year after year and have endured almost pathological frustration, the press who have suffered crisis in their lives and their institutions, the psychologists who helped those who had to cope with this tragedy, and the community that never knew when the terrorists would next appear. Part 1, The Slaughter Begins, 1974 to 76. History is lived forwards, but it is written in retrospect. We know the end before we consider the beginning, and we can never wholly recapture what it was to know the beginning only. C.V. Wedgwood, William the Silent. Chapter 1 The Day Wichita Changed. On Tuesday, January 15th, 1974, 15-year-old Charlie Otero walked home from Wichita High School Southeast. The afternoon sunshine had melted some of the snow into slush. Charlie was thinking about the girl he was to meet with that evening to study. Because of his two moves in one school semester from Panama to Oakland, Kansas, then to Wichita, Kansas, he felt behind in his studies. As he arrived home at about 3:40, he heard his 14-year-old brother Danny and 13-year-old sister Carmen June that had just entered the home a minute or so earlier. They were in their parents' bedroom, wailing in grief. When Charlie entered, Danny tearfully cried out, "Mom and Dad are playing a bad joke on us." Danny was cradling their father, 38-year-old Joseph Otero. Carmen June was cradling their mother, 34-year-old Julie. Joseph and Julie were tied up and bags covered their heads. Joseph, a recently retired Air Force pilot and mechanic and native of Puerto Rico, was dead. He had been found with his body face down on the floor at the foot of the bed. Wrists and ankles were bound with cord from Venetian blinds. Julie was found lying face down on the bed, also bound. Charlie used a kitchen knife to cut the ropes off of his father's neck, then off of his mother. He could not rouse them. He tried to use the phone in the kitchen to call for an ambulance, but there was no dial tone. Charlie ran from neighbor's house to neighbor's house screaming for help. He got the attention of neighbor Dell Johnson of 815 North Edgemore, who was outside shoveling snow. "Come quick, my father's dead, I think," Charlie cried. Johnson later said, "I went to the house and went through the living room and through a hall. I went into the hall, and the Oteros, looked motionless to me. I didn't examine them, but went immediately to call the police. The child said something about the telephone wires being cut. I told him I was going to my house and I would get help as quick as I could." Johnson dialed "O" on his rotary phone and spoke with the operator. He asked for an ambulance to be sent to 803 North Edgemore. In his pre-EMS era, Wichita, like most American cities, had multiple competing ambulance services. The telephone operator called the nearest service on the list, which was the American Red Cross ambulance. Then the telephone operator called the police dispatcher. There were 6 separate radio dispatchers for the 6 different city and county emergency services, each with separate 7-digit telephone numbers. The telephone operator advised the police that a Red Cross ambulance was en route to 803 North Edgemore. Lieutenant Harold Klein took the call. Unless all units were occupied, it was routine police procedure to dispatch a patrol car to any call for an ambulance. The nearest Wichita Police Department patrol officer was Robert Bob Bulla. Bulla had a rookie law enforcement officer just out of the police academy riding with him for that shift only. Klein radioed Bulla to follow up an ambulance. So far, this was a routine afternoon for all the involved emergency service personnel. At this time, neither Klein, Bulla, the rookie officer, the telephone operator, or the 2-member Red Cross ambulance crew knew that they were becoming involved with a homicide case that would remain unsolved for more than 3 decades and eventually draw international attention. In the meantime, Charlie Otero's mind was racing. He was bitterly angry with his father, blaming his father's activity for this carnage. He did not want his beloved younger siblings, 11-year-old Josie and 9-year-old Joey, to see this. They would be dismissed from Adams Elementary School at 4 p.m. and walk the 3/4 of a mile home. Charlie sent Danny and Carmen June out to intercept them. Officer Bulla arrived moments after the ambulance and saw Charlie talking with the ambulance crew in the front yard. Charlie was tugging on the members of the ambulance crew's arms, trying to get them to rush into the house. The ambulance crew, hearing Charlie's story, were shaking their heads, saying that the police needed to enter first. The Otero home was on the northwest corner of the Edgemore and Murdoch Streets. The house was a white wood frame with fake black shutters. There was a small front porch with 2 concrete steps leading up to it. 2 evergreen trees grew on either side of the house. There were shrubs along the front of the house on either side of the porch steps. A brown throw rug had been tossed over the porch railing. Bulla stepped out of his patrol car wearing a flat-topped and brimmed police officer's hat and gloves, and tan uniform pants with a dark green stripe up each side. Fuller remembers that he wore red wing boots he had purchased from Champ's, a store that catered to many in Wichita who wore uniforms, located not far from the intersection of Lincoln and Hydraulic Streets. The manager of that Champ's shoe store told the author that she sold many Wichita police officers Red Wing brand boots, but other officers reported that they wore Fry brand motorcycle boots obtained from Head Shoe Store located near Douglas and Oliver Streets. The type of boot an officer wore and many other details, including the brand of cigarette smoke, would later become controversies in the investigation. Buller entered the house with Charlie, the ambulance crew, and the rookie officer riding with him. Entering the master bedroom, Buller saw that Joseph and Julie Otero were both bound with rope and already cold from death. The bodies had entered rigor mortis, which indicated they had been dead for hours. The ambulance crew confirmed Buller's assessment. Joseph had been positioned by the children on his back on the floor so that his stockinged feet were resting on his black briefcase. Joseph was wearing white socks and blue pants that were cuffed at the bottom. His ankles had been tied tightly together with cord. On the top of Joseph's dresser drawer were eyeglasses, an ashtray, and a variety of personal items. There was a large butcher knife next to Joseph's body, which Charlie Otero had used to cut the ropes from his mother and father's necks. Pieces of intricately tied cord lay on the floor next to Joseph Otero's arm and the butcher's knife. The cord was very white and appeared new. Marks on the wrist showed where they had been bound together. While Joseph's wrists were close to the normal size, his hands were grossly swollen. The bindings had permitted blood and lymph to enter his hands, but restricted its exit, causing the swelling. Both Joseph Otero's nose and mouth had bled. There was a plastic bag lying next to his head. When the police photos were taken, Julie Otero was sprawled on the bed, lying across the middle, with her feet stuck off the side. Her face was covered with dry blood that had come from her nose and her mouth. In life she had been beautiful. Now her face was swollen and almost unrecognizable. Blood from her nose had dripped down both sides of her face and had gathered in her ears, and her long black hair was loose beneath her. A single slim cord bound her ankles. She was barefoot. Her neck was bruised, where the binding had been pressing until Charlie cut the rope away with a butcher's knife. Julie's hands were open and resting palms down on her midsection, her neatly trimmed nails unmarred. She was wearing a blue quilt button housecoat and light blue zippered and top button cotton pants. Her eyes were closed. Buller glanced around quickly and saw that the drawers to the Otero's dressers had all been pulled out and someone had rummaged through their contents. Buller ordered the ambulance crew out, put Charlie in the patrol car, and called for a supervisor and homicide squad. The multiple murder alarm was just before 4 p.m. By phone and radio, Lieutenant Klein began making notifications of field commanders, command rank officers, homicide detectives, and the lab men, now called crime scene investigators. Wichita Police Department Sergeant Joseph R. Thomas was drinking iced tea at the Pancake House on 9th Street and Broadway when he received the dispatcher's call over his portable radio. So this is a very interesting book, and I'm going to stop reading now. But I just ran across this, and I thought, wow, this is interesting. And I thought, well, maybe you might find it interesting too. So I read some of it. And if you're interested, you can probably find the book somewhere, hopefully, and then you can read it. And I think I might get it. I'm not sure. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed me reading that little bit, and I hope you enjoyed that book. It's very interesting to learn about these types of things because there's so much knowledge that we don't have without reading these sorts of things, especially the past. And it's interesting the way the phones worked, and they used to have the phones where they could cut the lines. And back then, they probably, and it's interesting they didn't catch them for years and years and years, I wonder, did they ever catch them? Do you know? Anyway, it's very sad for the families to come home and to find these things. And we want these people to be punished, but you really just want them back. When something like this happens to your loved ones, you just want them back. It just feels that any justice that they serve out doesn't bring them back, and that's what's very difficult. But then there's details about it that's interesting, like the phone, cutting the phone line, and I don't know. It's very sad that they weren't able to catch them right away, and now they're focusing on different things, and we have DNA and all these things now. So anyway, it's heart-wrenching, but it's still an interesting book. And I thank you so much for tuning into my channel. Don't forget to pray for the families of all of them, the families, the victims' families, the police department, and the investigator families, and everybody that has suffered through all of these things. And I thank you so much for tuning into my channel. Have a great day. Bye-bye.